Today's subject matter is a Steam release that I only paid a couple bucks for, so if that means anything, then I don't know what. Verdict Guilty, a 2016 Steam release from Retro Army Limited, is a one-on-one fighting game that's more in line with many of the would-be Street Fighter II clones of the 1990s than anything resembling a modern-day fighting game. Oh, you have some more modes than a second-rate fighter of the time would have, various arcade modes, a story mode, a survival mode, a training mode, and versus modes for local multiplayer, and none of that online stuff. But in terms of the gameplay itself, it's far more basic. You have 8 playable fighters to choose from, an even split of 4 law enforcement officers and 4 criminal bastards, each with their own set of basic and special attacks, and that's about it. No super moves or anything grandiose. It's simple, straightforward fisticuffs, and that's alright. Now, while the gameplay is fairly straightforward, there are a couple bits done here that mixes things up ever so slightly. The first is in the way that weapons or projectile attacks work in Verdict Guilty. You only have 3 shots of projectiles to launch, and then after that you need to reload, and reloading leaves you vulnerable to attack for about a couple seconds. It's not a bad idea actually, as it emphasizes making those shots count and possibly, but not necessarily, minimize fireball spamming for lack of a better term. The other additional bit is that Verdict Guilty also has a throw mechanic, which, okay, a throw is a common feature in most fighting games, but the throw here varies depending on whether you're a cop or a crook. A cop throw is essentially cuffing your opponent, leaving them incapacitated for a short period before they break off the cuffs. Now, while they're cuffed, if you manage to knock them out, they'll be arrested and thrown in jail, as the nice little graphic will show. As a counterpoint, a criminal throw essentially has them stabbing their opponent in the back, dizzying them or something to that effect for a short period of time, and if an opponent is KO'd in this state, they are deemed wasted or killed, even though their mugshots do not change from the normal KO'd variant. Which is a bit of a shame, a missed opportunity if you will. For the most part, Verdict Guilty seemingly takes inspiration from Street Fighter II in terms of the character select layout, the versus screens, the simplistic fighting mechanics, the high damage bits, and so on and so forth. But there is one touch that I actually kind of like. It's a minor thing, it's a very tiny thing, but it's a nice thing nonetheless. See, in arcade mode there are no mirror matches, no same character versus same character with a slightly different color palette. Instead, when the time comes, you face off against a similar looking but still very different fighter who has the same set of attacks that you do and all that jazz. I suppose in a way you could call these alternate skins or costumes or whatever the case may be, and that's actually a nice touch, and it would have been nice to be able to play as these alternate characters instead of doing the mirror match things that you could do easily in the other modes, but I don't know. I digress. For what it's worth, Verdict Guilty plays on the competent side of things. The fighting engine is fairly solid for the most part, the controls are pretty responsive, so pulling off moves shouldn't be difficult. That last statement needs to be stressed because the commands for the various specials in this game are almost stupidly simple. Some simple button combinations, hold this button for X amount of time, that sort of thing. The quarter circle joystick motion that's prevalent in most fighting games is perhaps the most complex command in Verdict Guilty, which says quite a bit. Pausing the game brings up a moves list so you know what you're doing, though the game does give you a primer on each character's attacks at certain times. The game does allow you to rebind your keyboard setup if you care for that sort of thing, but those wishing to play this with a gamepad are stuck with whatever default setup they give you, and that's it. Now fortunately, playing this with the standard Xbox 360 controller, and even an Xbox One controller works fine. It plays fine with those controllers. But if you want to use a fight stick or some other fancy thing, that's something you'll need to configure in Steam if you find it's worth the headache, and honestly, I don't know if it is. Verdict Guilty is not bad for a cheapo game. It's playable enough to be somewhat enjoyable in small doses, and the various arcade modes you unlock, such as a one-hit KO, duel mode, and turbo modes, are worthwhile experiments, while the story mode adds specific goals to each fight to make them more fulfilling, I guess. Actually, you know what? I need a little advice on this. Is this the part where I include the cliche about a cheapo fighter made in a basement having an arcade mode while the hit new Street Fighter V that they're still putting out in bits and pieces does not have? I'm not quite sure how to play that angle. Honestly, I don't know if I want to, even though I just kinda sorta did. Oh well. Moving on. The only real sticking point that I have with Verdict Guilty is the occasional bit of slowdown that happens at times when characters are airborne. I'm not talking about the slowdown that occurs after a KO, that's a standard fighting game trope. No, I'm talking about occasional aerial attacks that will slow down the action at random intervals, usually during conveniently occurring bits bordering on naughty awkwardness. This isn't a hardware thing, by the way, as it happens on both my old PC and this new one that I bought just a couple months ago. There's also no difficulty setting of any kind to be found here to make the game easier or harder. You only have the one difficulty that lies firmly in the moderate challenge level, possibly a bit easy for the most experienced fighters, while not as much of a cakewalk for less than pro players or something to that extent. I should also probably chime in that there's no online capability, so if you want multiplayer, you have to do it locally, and that usually means 2 people in the same room, which is generally more fun, but that's just me. When it comes to the graphics, the visuals, the overall presentation, it's a decidedly mixed bag of the mileage-varying variety. I like the atmosphere that Verdict Guilty tries to convey, something of a late 80s Asian action flick. I like the player select screen that's almost a callback to Street Fighter 2, and I like some of the backgrounds. Unfortunately, those are the only few high spots to the visuals. The character designs, the character mugshots, not a fan. I want to say that Verdict Guilty is a game that looks best in still images, but the overall artwork has something of a crude, almost amateurish feel to it, almost as though everything was just quick doodles drawn on paper, and then were scanned and turned into graphical assets to be used in a video game. The somewhat shoddy animation also doesn't really help matters for me. Now admittedly, this would have looked somewhat better than some of the more rubbish looking fighting games of that era that this game's trying to emulate, but I don't know. I'm just not sold on the art style, but that could be just me. Again, it's one of those mileage-varying kinds. Sound is also a bit on the average side, a case of it being neither terrible nor remarkable. Lots of somewhat decent sounding sound effects for the various impacts, gunshots and stuff, but very minimal vocal bits. Only grunts and victory cheers in general. It's an odd feeling when you're playing a fighting game and nobody's calling out moves like it's some ritual or something. It's just a little strange. The soundtrack's just okay. It's not a bad collection of tunes by any means, but rather just an average set. Fills the background just fine, I suppose, so yeah, that's all I got. Overall, if you've got a couple bucks to spend and pretty much blew through all the much better fighting games you could find on the Steam service, then Verdict Guilty is cheap, harmless fun that'll give you a nice back rub for a short while before you're ready for something a little meatier. It's not the most refined piece of business, the slow down aerials for example, but it's still playable enough that it can be enjoyed for short bursts. On a whole, Verdict Guilty is a nice little throwback with mileage-varying presentation, competent gameplay, and a bit of charm. So no need for a guilty verdict here or whatever pudding-brained analogy you want to go with. This one's alright.